12 years ago, an engineering team in Hiroshima shut down a production line for the last time, and the automotive world seemed certain the story was over. The engine had survived for decades, but emissions regulations, fuel economy demands, and its own engineering weaknesses had finally caught up with it. In 2012, Mazda's legendary rotary engine appeared to be finished. Owners moved on, competitors stopped paying attention, and even inside Mazda, many believed there was no future left for it. But behind the scenes, a small group of engineers refused to let it die. They kept testing, they kept redesigning, and while the rest of the industry moved toward an entirely different future, these engineers kept working on a question almost nobody else was willing to ask. What if the rotary engine could be reinvented instead of abandoned? Now, more than a decade later, Mazda has brought it back, and not simply as a nostalgic tribute to the past. The rotary has returned in a role that could influence some of Mazda's most important vehicles and potentially reshape how the company approaches electrification. Even more surprising, there are signs that this comeback may be only the beginning. So why did Mazda resurrect an engine the industry had already written off? What did its engineers change to make the rotary relevant again? And what is hiding behind Mazda's latest announcement that could make this comeback far bigger than anyone expected? Before we uncover what Mazda has been working on all these years, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story is about to get a lot more interesting. To understand why Mazda made this decision, you first need to understand the mindset behind the company itself, because Mazda has never approached the automotive industry quite like its larger competitors. When people talk about the biggest names in the car world, companies like Tesla, BYD, Toyota, and Hyundai usually dominate the conversation. Mazda is rarely the first name mentioned, but that has little to do with the quality of its vehicles. The company has simply developed a reputation for taking a different path. Rather than immediately jumping onto whatever trend is dominating the industry, Mazda often takes its time, studies the problem from every angle, and then develops its own solution, sometimes long after everyone else assumes the idea has already been abandoned. That independent streak goes all the way back to Mazda's origins. The company was founded in Hiroshima in 1920, and at the time, automobiles were not even its main business. Mazda originally manufactured cork products and machine tools. It was not until 1931 that the company entered the vehicle business with the Mazda Go, a compact three-wheeled truck. From there, Mazda gradually expanded into passenger cars and began building an identity based less on sheer size and more on engineering character. Today, the company sells roughly 1.2 million vehicles annually across more than 120 countries. That is nowhere near the volume of giants like Toyota or Volkswagen, but Mazda has maintained a remarkably loyal customer base, with many buyers choosing its cars because of the way they drive, rather than simply because of the badge on the hood. And that same stubborn engineering philosophy is what eventually pulled Mazda toward one of the strangest engine designs ever put into a production car, the rotary. The story begins in the 1960s when Hiroshima was still rebuilding from the devastation of war, and Mazda engineers decided to take a chance on rotary technology. Other major automakers had investigated the concept and ultimately walked away. Mazda didn't. On paper, the design was incredibly appealing. Instead of conventional pistons constantly moving up and down inside cylinders, a rotary engine uses a triangular-shaped rotor that spins continuously inside a specially designed housing. As it rotates, it moves through the intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust cycles, creating power while occupying a remarkably compact space, an engine often compared in size to something as ordinary as a watermelon. But that compact design came with serious compromises. The shape of the combustion chamber made it difficult to burn fuel as completely as a conventional piston engine, hurting efficiency. Then there were the apex seals, tiny components responsible for maintaining the seal between the rotor and housing. They were vulnerable to wear, and that could eventually create reliability and maintenance problems. For most manufacturers, those disadvantages outweighed the benefits. Mazda saw the equation differently. Instead of abandoning the technology, it decided to prove that a rotary could survive in the real world. That proof arrived in 1967 with the Cosmo Sport. The little sports car demonstrated that Mazda's unusual engine wasn't merely an engineering experiment. It could actually power a production vehicle. From there, the rotary became deeply connected to Mazda's identity. The technology eventually found its way into legendary cars like the RX-7 and later the RX-8. But by 2012, the same weaknesses that Mazda had spent decades trying to overcome had become increasingly difficult to justify as global fuel economy and emissions requirements became more demanding. The RX-8 disappeared from production, and for a while, it looked like the rotary's story had finally reached its final chapter. Except Mazda wasn't ready to let it end, and the reason the engine eventually returned has surprisingly little to do with nostalgia. Instead, it connects to one of the biggest challenges facing electric vehicles today. For everyday driving, an EV can be incredibly easy to live with. It is quiet, responsive, comfortable, and delivers instant acceleration. But take that same vehicle on a long-distance trip, and a completely different set of concerns can appear. Where is the next charger? Will it be available when you arrive? How long will you have to wait before you can continue the journey? The obvious solution seems simple. Install a much larger battery. But that creates another set of problems. More battery means more weight. More weight means higher costs and can require even more materials. Suddenly, solving the range problem by simply increasing battery size does not look nearly as straightforward as it first appeared. Mazda approached the problem from another direction. Instead of forcing the vehicle to carry an enormous battery everywhere, what if the car could use a smaller battery and generate additional electricity only when it was actually needed? That concept eventually became the foundation for the MX-30 eSkyactiv REV. And this is where Mazda's legendary rotary made its unexpected return, but with one major difference. This time, the rotary engine isn't responsible for moving the vehicle. The electric motor does all of the actual driving. The rotary has been given an entirely different job, acting as a generator. When the battery reaches a low enough level, the rotary starts up and produces electricity, which is then used to recharge the battery and keep the electric motor supplied with power. Under the hood sits an 830 cubic centimeter single-rotor engine designed specifically for this role. Mazda also replaced the heavier iron construction of the older Renesis engine used in the RX-8 with aluminum, reducing the engine's weight by roughly 15 kilograms. The system combines that rotary generator with a 17.8 kilowatt-hour battery, providing approximately 53 miles of electric-only driving before the range extender becomes necessary. A 50-liter fuel tank can then push the vehicle's overall range to nearly 400 miles once the generator begins supplying electricity. But the numbers themselves are not the most interesting part of this comeback. The real story is what Mazda changed underneath the surface. Simply taking the old rotary engine, putting it back into a vehicle and hoping for a different result would have solved nothing. the same problems that helped kill the original design would eventually return. So, Mazda went back to the engine and redesigned some of its most critical components. For the first time in Mazda's rotary engine history, the company introduced direct fuel injection, allowing fuel to be delivered directly into the combustion chamber with far greater precision than the older systems could achieve. The goal was to improve combustion efficiency, while also reducing emissions. Mazda also incorporated an EGR system designed to reduce cooling losses when the engine is operating at low speeds and light loads, conditions where older rotary designs were particularly inefficient. And then there was the component that had haunted the rotary engine for decades: the apex seal. Mazda increased the width of these seals by roughly 25%, bringing them to around 2.5 millimeters, while also changing the surface coating of the trochoid housing to reduce friction. In other words, Mazda didn't simply bring the old rotary engine back. It took the fundamental weaknesses that had helped kill it, studied them again, and rebuilt the engine around a completely different purpose. Mazda didn't stop at changing the engine's internal components. The company also treated the side housings with a ceramic thermal spray coating, giving them greater protection against the intense heat cycles a rotary engine experiences. None of these changes magically transform the rotary into a flawless engine, but together they target many of the weaknesses that pushed the technology toward extinction in the first place. Mazda has essentially taken the problems that once defined the rotary and redesigned the system around them, creating an engine the company's engineers now believe can have a meaningful future. But this is where the story gets much more interesting, because Mazda's rotary revival isn't limited to generating electricity for an electric vehicle. Since 2012, enthusiasts have been waiting for something much more ambitious, and Mazda has finally confirmed that it is developing a true rotary-powered sports car inspired by the striking iconic SP concept unveiled in 2023. And this isn't simply the MX-30's single-rotor range extender placed inside a sports car body. The iconic SP uses a twin-rotor configuration, combining two 830 cubic centimeter rotors to produce an estimated 365 to 370 horsepower in concept form. The goal isn't to recreate the RX-7 exactly. Instead, Mazda appears to be trying to capture the spirit of that legendary car and bring it into a completely different era. Mazda's chief technical officer has described the iconic SP as a natural successor to the RX-7, while the company's design chief has made it clear that this isn't being treated like another fantasy concept that will eventually disappear into a storage facility. Mazda has indicated that the car is being developed with production in mind. There is still one major question hanging over the project. Exactly how will that twin-rotor engine deliver its power? Some reports suggest Mazda could continue with the same basic philosophy used in the MX-30, allowing the rotary to function exclusively as a generator while electric motors drive the wheels. But comments from Mazda engineers have also suggested that the hybrid system could be more versatile, potentially allowing the rotary to mechanically drive the wheels in at least one version. If that happens, it would represent a major change from Mazda's current rotary strategy and would bring the company closer to the kind of direct rotary-powered sports car enthusiasts have been waiting for since the RX-8 disappeared. Even the launch date remains uncertain. Some reports have suggested 2026, while others have pushed the expected arrival into 2027. Mazda has repeatedly indicated that the final decision will depend heavily on market conditions rather than being tied to an immovable production schedule. Meanwhile, enthusiasts have already given the car a nickname, RX-9, but Mazda itself has never officially confirmed that name. What we can examine right now is the iconic SP concept itself, because the level of detail Mazda put into the design suggests this was never intended to be nothing more than an auto show sculpture. The concept measures 164.5 inches from nose to tail, 72.8 inches across, and only 45.2 inches high, riding on a 102-inch wheelbase. Inside, it is strictly a two-seat sports car, while the exterior features dramatic swan-style doors and a distinctive red finish Mazda created specifically for the concept called Viola Red. Mazda also targeted a curb weight below 1,500 kilograms. That's an especially challenging goal for a modern hybrid sports car because the engineers have to account for the additional mass of batteries, electric motors, and all the hardware required to make the system work. Yet Mazda paired that target with another number that has become almost sacred within the company: a 50-50 front-to-rear weight distribution. That balance is a philosophy Mazda has carried through its sports cars for decades, from the original MX-5 Miata onward. And when you put all of these details together, the iconic SP begins to look less like a design experiment and more like an actual engineering blueprint. Mazda has also been very deliberate about where this car will sit in the lineup. It isn't being developed to replace the MX-5. Instead, the company appears to want both cars to exist side by side, something Mazda hasn't really been able to offer in recent years. The MX-5 would remain the lightweight, relatively accessible sports car, while the new rotary-powered machine would occupy a higher position, delivering substantially more performance through its twin-rotor hybrid system. Depending on the final production specifications, automotive journalists have already started comparing the upcoming Mazda to cars such as the next-generation Toyota GR Supra and an electrified Porsche 718 Cayman. Those are serious competitors, and Mazda clearly understands that entering this segment means playing a very different game from the one it plays with the MX-5. But there is another development happening at Mazda that could be just as important, and it has received far less attention. At roughly the same time this rotary sports car is being developed, Mazda is working on an entirely new engine platform known as Skyactiv-Z for the next-generation MX-5, which is expected around 2027. That means two of Mazda's most important sports cars could potentially arrive within a relatively short window. Yet, they would represent two completely different engineering philosophies. One would continue the MX-5's lightweight sports car tradition with the new Skyactiv-Z engine. The other would bring Mazda's twin-rotor hybrid technology into a higher-performance machine. In other words, Mazda may soon have two very different answers to the same question. What should a modern sports car feel like? And Mazda's ambitions may not end there. The same engineering effort behind the rotary revival has also been connected to patents exploring ways to operate rotary engines using carbon-neutral fuels and, potentially, hydrogen in the future. That isn't an entirely new idea for Mazda. The company experimented with hydrogen-powered rotary engines as far back as the 2000s, so this appears to be another chapter in a research program that has been evolving for years. Then, there is an entirely separate Mazda project that sounds even stranger. The company has filed a patent describing a 6-stroke piston engine concept designed to extract hydrogen from conventional gasoline during the combustion process. The hydrogen would then be used to generate additional power, while the remaining carbon would theoretically be captured and stored inside the vehicle rather than simply being expelled through the exhaust. That technology is separate from Mazda's rotary program, but together these projects reveal something fascinating about the company's philosophy. While much of the automotive industry has increasingly treated the internal combustion engine as a technology with no long-term future, Mazda continues to approach the problem from another direction. Instead of asking whether gasoline engines should simply disappear, Mazda keeps asking a different question. What if the engine itself isn't the problem? What if the real issue is how we use it, what fuel we put into it, and what role we expect it to play? And that brings us to the bigger question. If Mazda is pursuing this unconventional path, what does it mean for the companies that have already committed almost entirely to electric vehicles? Tesla has built its entire identity around battery electric transportation, supported by an enormous charging network, and that strategy works extremely well in regions where charging infrastructure is readily available. BYD has taken another route, combining battery electric vehicles with plug-in hybrids and using a much broader powertrain strategy to reach different markets. Mazda, meanwhile, is betting that the future may not belong to just one type of propulsion. And that could make its strangest decision, the decision to bring back an engine everyone thought was dead, far more important than it first appears. BYD has chosen a very different strategy, relying on enormous manufacturing capacity to build both electric vehicles and hybrids at prices that are difficult for many competitors to match. Mazda isn't trying to beat either company by producing more cars or undercutting them on price. Instead, it is making a very different bet. Mazda believes there is still a significant group of drivers, especially people living outside major urban areas, where charging infrastructure can be limited or unreliable, who want the quietness and smooth acceleration of an electric vehicle without the anxiety that can come from depending entirely on charging stations. For those drivers, having a backup system that can restore energy with a quick trip to a fuel station could offer a level of convenience that a massive battery simply cannot provide. But whether that strategy succeeds is something only the next few years will reveal. Charging networks are expanding, consumer habits are changing, and the automotive market itself is moving faster than almost anyone predicted. Mazda doesn't know exactly where that evolution will lead, and neither does anyone else. What we do know is much more surprising. An engine that the automotive industry effectively declared dead in 2012 is now powering a production hybrid. A more powerful twin-rotor version is reportedly moving toward a genuine sports car within the next year or two. And beyond that, Mazda has continued exploring technologies that could eventually connect the rotary engine to carbon-neutral fuels and even hydrogen. That leaves Mazda with a fascinating gamble. Its rotary revival could eventually become an important alternative for solving one of the biggest weaknesses of electric vehicles, long-distance driving. Or it could remain an unconventional experiment that enthusiasts remember as one of the industry's most interesting detours. Right now, nobody knows which outcome is coming. But one thing is already undeniable. Almost everyone believed Mazda's rotary engine had reached the end of the road in 2012. Yet more than a decade later, it is back, quietly sitting inside a production vehicle, being developed for a new generation of sports cars, and appearing in some of Mazda's most ambitious engineering plans in years.